coronavirus does not really care about borders. It's gonna, the coronavirus is a pandemic at this point. But the environmental crisis also doesn't care about borders. What's happening is that, so fascist forces, fascist politics always uses crisis tries to use crisis because they want that idea that you need a strong leader to protect you.
No meu caso particular, pelo meu histórico de atleta, caso fosse contaminado pelo vírus, não precisaria me preocupar. Nada sentiria ou seria, quando muito, acometido de uma gripezinha ou resfriadinho.
That leader has to be competent at this kind of politics to project that they are the leader to protect you. They also, what they're going to do is bend whatever crisis it is to their own advantage, their own ideology. So what you find in the United States today with President Trump's first set of responses, first of all, he dismantled all the infectious diseases office. There isn't an office of infectious diseases because Barack Obama set it up. So anything that Barack Obama set up must go. So we were left with no preparation. He sought to first downplay it, but now he's trying to use it to his advantage. He's trying to say, see, all along I was right about closing borders. All along I was right that China is our enemy. And so instead of dealing with the crisis, he's trying to tell Americans, oh yeah, remember, I'm the closing borders guy. Now, it's too late to close the borders. The coronavirus is already in the United States. Closing borders is now not a central part of the solution. There's going to be a crisis no matter what.
Using this, a lot of people say it's racist.
It's not racist at all, no, not at all. It comes from China.
So we're going to see whether whether his supporters accept the idea that this is support for his ideology. We should have closed borders. The European Union is our enemy. I mean, the banning travel from the European Union, what he's saying, and not from the United Kingdom, he's saying that's because the European Union doesn't have closed borders and the United Kingdom does. So what we want is countries with closed borders. So he's trying to bend it to his ideology. All he cares about is winning the next election. And so what's going to happen is if the virus gets out of control, which I fear it will, I hope some of his supporters realize that closing the borders, ultranationalism, China, none of that is relevant to solving this problem.
Like the coronavirus can be like a moment of truth for supporters of Trump, supporters of Bolsonaro as well.
Well, let's hope. I saw a wonderful. I saw a cartoon that showed a picture of us, like it said on one end, us, and then them, two different faces, and then the third panel said coronavirus, and the two faces were just skulls, and it said us and them. So coronavirus, like the environmental crisis, should bring us together.
Levar a verdade à população brasileira, mas que essa verdade não ultrapasse o limite do pânico. Como disse o ministro da Saúde agora há pouco, nós passaremos por isso. Já tivemos problemas mais graves no passado, que não teve essa comoção toda ou repercussão toda por parte da mídia brasileira.
What the goal of a lot of these governments now is to show by example that government is incompetent, that government can't do anything, that the private sector has to do everything. So if you bankrupt the government and a crisis comes and the government is incompetent, it actually promotes your ideology because the government is incompetent. So I fear we've arrived at that moment, and we'll see whether that tactic works to delegitimize government, or instead, if we all say, wouldn't it be great if we had a competent government?
Brazil has also deep roots with the early 20th century European fascism, you talk about it. Getúlio Vargas had lots in common with Italy's Mussolini before the Second War. And can Bolsonaro be some kind of evocation of these historical relations?
Yes, I think Bolsonaro is not an intellectual like some of the fascists in the 1930s, the integralists were, Salgado being the most obvious example. He doesn't share Barroso's horrific anti-Semitism. But if you take away the anti-Semitism of a Barroso, of some of the figures in integralism, you get Bolsonaro. They were Catholic, but the tradition being defended then was Catholic tradition. The tradition being defended now is Christianity and evangelicals. But as in my country of the United States, Brazil has a fascist tradition, and Brazil has a tradition of military dictatorship. Fascism involves, unlike ordinary conservatism, which is part of democratic politics, fascism involves a veneration of militarism. And fascism involves an open repudiation of democracy. Unfortunately, Brazil has a recent history of open repudiation of democracy. There are Brazilians alive who remember with fondness the military dictatorship. And so if you put together Brazil's long history, the fact that all of our countries in the 20th century have these anti-communist movements, these that are not just anti-communist, but militarist, anti-democracy, representing democracy as communism, essentially, which is what fascism does, represents a non-communist democracy as communism, and then says you need a strong fascist, a strong leader to beat that down. Brazil has a long history of this, and various forms of it. It's absolutely right that anti-communism is what holds fascism together. And the painting of your opponents as communists. Remember that the Nazi target was not Orthodox Jews, it was Judeo-Bolsheviks, as in Paul Hannebrink's recent book about Judeo-Bolshevism. Communism was identified with Jews, with a certain group of Jews, secular, atheist, communist Jews. Those were the targets of Hitler. So the difference between what you have now with a lot of these movements is all they've done is they removed Jews from being the force behind communism and left everything else intact. So, Goebbels says the ordinary citizen will not vote for us unless they think the Bolsheviks are right around the corner to steal their houses. Meaning you have to present the Social Democrats as Bolsheviks, as communists. Now for the Nazis, as I just said, they thought communism was a Jewish invention. So right now you have two groups. One, a small group who still thinks that communism was a Jewish invention and unions and labor unions are Jewish inventions. And the other, a much larger group that includes many Jewish people, some Jewish people, who agree with everything except they do not think that it's Jews who are behind communism. A couple differences between now and then. One difference is that there were actually Bolsheviks and communists ready to take over the government, and they were actually a threat. Now that's not the case in Western societies, in very few Western societies. Obviously in Venezuela, it was the case, but Lula was not a communist. Bernie Sanders is not a communist. Barack Obama was certainly not a communist or a socialist. So you have to change. So that's one big difference, that there actually was a threat. The other big difference, but they've adjusted for that. Olavo has, and others, talk about cultural Marxism. And what is cultural Marxism? Well, the idea is that communism now takes a different form. It's cultural. Instead of the revolution of the proletariat, it's the revolution of ethnic groups, of minorities, of women, of sexual minorities. It's cultural Marxism. And now that's the supposed threat. So what you do is you just take the old economic Marxism and you say, oh, well, the real threat now is political correctness. And that really is communism. It's cultural Marxism, and it's totalitarianism. And you need a strong leader to defend you against that.
O presidente recebeu para um almoço no Palácio do Planalto Maria Joseíta Silva Brilhante. Ele elogiou o trabalho da viúva e também o coronel reformado do Exército, que morreu há quase 4 anos.
So fascism always looks back to a military past, to a great military past when there were traditional gender roles, where people lived in the countryside, when they had their when the family was intact. And the idea, and we've had, and you look back to that, and then again, you take cultural Marxism as your enemy, and you say, look, feminism, transgender ideology, homosexuality, these things are destroying us. Look back to the past. We didn't have these 30, 40 years ago. We didn't have this threat to the family. And hey, we had a military dictatorship. Why did we not have this threat to the family? Bolsonaro can say, because we had a strong military dictatorship giving us values and protecting our tradition. And so there have been these advances in minority rights. There have been these advances in egalitarianism. And they've been economic too. Lula brought so many poor people into the lower middle class. So there have been these advances in equality, and advances in equality can be represented as threats to the dominant group. To the rich, the advances of the poor can be represented as threats, and to the poor, the advances of women, the advances of sexual minorities, the advances, right, of fellow, yeah, it can be and the advances of non-white people into positions such as you can represent affirmative action for black people in universities as a threat to you. You can say, for instance, look, affirmative action is threatening our status. We should be the ones that get the university places, not black students. So Brazil has a long history of racial inequality, very similar to the United States, but it's less discussed. And that is being exploited by Bolsonaro, I believe.
And I gave him a very gift. I gave him a good gift. We didn't charge him tariffs on something, and that made him much more popular.
Well, we have a long history of U.S. interference in Latin American affairs. If you think of the case of Pinochet and Chile, if you think of a very clear example of fascism in Latin America supported by the United States, we can think of historical examples that are much more recent than going back to the early part of the 20th century. So in some sense, we're returning back to the familiar relationship of empire, where the United States links with military dictatorships in Latin America to defeat democracy. Campaigns like Pat Buchanan's in 1992. You can look back at the long history of white Christian nationalism, and you can see that this is what is being evoked by the current president. It differs from other countries' fascist movements or neo-fascist movements in the ways that the United States differs from those countries. Because fascism is based on ultranationalism, and each country's fascism will look like that country. Brazil's fascist movements during integralism looked like Brazil and were distinct from Italy and Germany. But all of them involved a kind of a defense of tradition. And in the United States, a defense of tradition means defending white Christian nationalism. I think fascism will always be with us. My view of fascism as a philosopher is that it's something that it has a contemporary version, because for it to be fascism, it must be in opposition to communism. And communism and fascism in that sense are more recent. But this hatred of democracy, this idea that democracy is weak and unprincipled, that you need a strong leader to deal with a hated minority, that you need a strong leader to deal with threats to tradition, that you need a strong leader who will fight your enemy and protect you from decadence, from homosexuality, from feminism. That goes back in some versions to Plato's Republic. I mean, in Book 8 of Plato's Republic, Plato warns us that democracy will lead to a tyrant who raises fear about enemies and presents himself as the savior. So that will always be there. Fascism is a particular version of that, where the people that are to be protected are defined in terms of a skin color, an ethnicity, and a religion or a religion. The traditions are the traditional gender roles, the traditional sexual roles, and certain other aspects that are more contemporary. But I think we will always struggle with this, with various versions of this. It's in the nature of democracy to have to beat this back. And the United States has a long history, thanks in large part to our Black population, of beating back fascism.